5,000 years ago, on the banks of a river in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization rose that would come to cover more ground than ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia combined. Historians call it the Indus Valley Civilization, and at its height, it was home to more than 5 million people, living in cities with covered drains and private bathrooms centuries before such comforts existed anywhere else on Earth. In one of its doorways, a merchant presses a carved stone into wet clay and lifts it away, leaving a mark that will outlast him by 5,000 years. Yet no palace has ever been found in its ruins, no royal tomb, no carving of a king standing over a defeated enemy, the kind of image that turns up almost everywhere else in the Bronze Age world. For 100 years, archaeologists filled that absence with the most hopeful story available. A civilization so advanced it had outgrown the need for kings and armies. The one truly peaceful society the ancient world ever produced. But absence is not evidence, and the same silence is now read a very different way. Its city walls turn out to have bastions and guarded gateways. Its simplest tools turn out to be weapons, scattered through ordinary homes by the thousand. Its graves turn out to hold a striking number of skulls, marked by violent injury. Peaceful and violent, both readings come from the same evidence, argued today by serious people with no resolution in sight. So whether you have come for the history, to follow a 5,000-year-old argument as far as it goes, or simply to let the story carry you into the quiet of the night, settle in. We begin where they began, on the banks of a river, 5,000 years ago. Long before any city rose on its banks, the river had already chosen its route across the plain. It began high in the mountains to the north, fed by snowmelt and monsoon rain, and by the time it reached the lowlands, it carried enough silt to rebuild the ground beneath it every year. To the east ran a second river system, following the dry bed now called the Hakra, once a substantial waterway in its own right, before it began to fail. Between these two rivers lay a floodplain of extraordinary generosity, flat, well-watered, and renewed each season by fresh soil carried down from the highlands. Nothing about this land forced people to build cities on it. It simply made building cities easier than almost anywhere else on the planet. The people who eventually built those cities did not appear suddenly. Their story starts more than 4,000 years earlier, in the foothills near the Bolan Pass, at a settlement now known as Mehrgarh. Here, as early as 7000 BC, families were already keeping herds and planting wheat and barley, choosing to stay in one place through a full cycle of seasons rather than follow game or forage as their ancestors had. Over thousands of years, their descendants refined that choice. Pottery appeared, then improved. Tools shifted from stone to copper. The settlement grew, shrank, and grew again, but the underlying skills never disappeared. Mehrgarh was not yet a city. It was the accumulation of everything a city would eventually require. By around 3300 BC, farming communities along the Ravi River, a tributary feeding into the wider river system, had begun to take on a different character. Villages that had once been loose clusters of homes started laying down streets. Houses were built from mud brick in shapes that suggest planning rather than habit. Craftspeople began producing pottery, beads, and tools not just for their own households, but for trade with neighboring settlements, moving materials like lapis lazuli and carnelian across distances of several hundred kilometers. This period, later named the Ravi phase after the river beside it, marks the first clear sign that these were no longer simple farming villages. Something more ambitious was beginning to take shape. A woman living in one of these early settlements would have measured her days by tasks that had barely changed in generations. She rose before the heat, ground grain by hand, tended animals that grazed on the floodplain grasses, and worked alongside her family to keep the mud brick walls of her home in repair after each season's rain. But something around her was shifting. The pottery she used carried more deliberate decoration than her grandmother's had. The beads traded through her village came from places she would never see. Strangers passed more often, carrying goods rather than simply seeking shelter. She could not have known she was living at the edge of something larger. No one standing inside a slow transformation ever can. Around 2800 BC, a new phase began, later named for a site called Kot Diji, where a fortified settlement with a raised citadel offers the clearest evidence yet of organized authority directing the labor of many hands. Walls thick enough to require real planning went up around the highest ground. Pottery styles became more consistent across a wider area, suggesting that separate communities were beginning to share not just goods but conventions, a common way of doing things that spread faster than any single village could invent on its own. This was not yet the world of Mohenjo-daro or Harappa at their height, but the ingredients were now unmistakably present: surplus food, specialized labor, long-distance trade, and communities large enough to need a form of leadership, however that leadership was organized. Across the wider region, dozens of settlements were moving through this same transformation at roughly the same pace, from Amri in the south to sites scattered along the Gagar Hakra in the east. This was not one town growing large while others stood still. It was a broad and roughly simultaneous shift, villages across an enormous stretch of territory, arriving at similar solutions to similar problems, at similar times, seemingly with little central direction. Archaeologists still debate exactly why so many communities converged on the same path together. What is not in dispute is the result. By the final centuries of the early Harappan period, the region was no longer a patchwork of isolated farming villages. It was a network, bound together by trade, shared technology, and a slowly emerging common culture. That final push into full urbanism did not happen without disruption. Several of the settlements that had defined the early Harappan period, including Kot Diji itself, show clear evidence of burning at the point where this phase gives way to the next. Whole towns appear to have been destroyed and, in some cases, never resettled in the same location. Some archaeologists point to accident or natural disaster. Others see the marks of conflict, communities competing for position as the stakes of this transformation rose. The evidence does not settle the question. What it does confirm is that the emergence of the great cities was not a peaceful, uninterrupted climb. Something happened in these final centuries that reshaped the map before the map had even finished being drawn. By roughly 2600 BC, the pace of change accelerated sharply. Settlements that had been modest towns for centuries began to grow at a scale their own ancestors would not have recognized. Streets widened and straightened. Bricks began to appear in a standardized ratio of length to width to height, the same ratio used regardless of which settlement produced them, hundreds of kilometers apart. Public buildings, larger than any single household could need, started rising on platforms built to lift them above the floodplain's seasonal floods. This was the threshold. Everything before this point had been preparation, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, always incremental. What came next would be sudden by comparison, and it would produce cities that still puzzle the people who study them today. It is worth pausing on how unusual this transition actually was, set against its Bronze Age neighbors. In Mesopotamia, urbanism grew up around temple complexes, and, before long, competing city-states ruled by kings who fought each other for territory and left records boasting of it. In Egypt, a unified kingdom formed early and centered almost entirely on the authority of a single ruler considered semi-divine. Here, in this river valley, no comparable figure has ever surfaced in the archaeological record. Whatever organized the shift from village to city, whatever decided where new settlements would be founded and how their bricks would be measured, it left no throne, no tomb built to outlast a mortal reign. No image of a face meant to be remembered as a ruler's. By the last generation of the early Harappan period, the largest of these settlements had already outgrown anything else in the region. Trade routes reached towards the Arabian Sea in one direction and up toward the mountain passes in another, carrying raw materials in and finished goods out. Populations were rising fast enough that new land had to be brought into cultivation simply to keep pace. A person born into one of these growing towns around 2650 BC would spend a lifetime watching it change almost beyond recognition. Streets appearing where there had been open ground, strangers arriving in numbers no one could remember seeing before. They stood, without knowing it, on the final threshold before the age of cities began in earnest. What makes this slow build worth dwelling on is what it rules out from the very beginning. The cities that were about to rise were not imposed from outside by conquest, the way some ancient urban centers were founded following an invasion. They were not the sudden creation of a single visionary ruler, the way later traditions sometimes claimed for other civilizations. They grew, brick by brick and generation by generation, out of communities that had spent 3,000 years learning to farm a floodplain, trade across long distances, and coordinate labor at increasing scale. Whatever governed that process, whether a council, a merchant class, a religious authority, or something else altogether, it operated for centuries without needing to leave behind the kind of monument that other Bronze Age societies built almost reflexively. By 2600 BC, the villages along the Ravi were gone, not abandoned but transformed beyond recognition into something the region had never seen before. Streets ran straight. Bricks matched a single standard from one settlement to another. Trade goods moved along established routes rather than passed hand to hand between neighbors. The long, uneven climb from Mehrgarh's earliest farmers to this moment was complete. What came next were cities on a scale that would not be matched in parts of the world for another 3,000 years, and a silence about who, exactly, had built them that has never fully been broken. Approach either of the two great cities from a distance, and the first thing visible is height. Not towers, but a raised mound rising above the floodplain, built deliberately from tons of packed mud and brick to lift the settlement above the reach of the seasonal floods. This platform carries the western citadel, the higher and more fortified half of the city. To its east spreads the lower town, larger, more populous, and laid out with a precision that still surprises anyone seeing it for the first time. Streets run north to south and east to west, meeting at clean right angles, the main avenues wide enough for carts to pass, the narrower lanes between them just wide enough for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder. Nothing about this arrangement happened by accident. Someone decided where these streets would run before a single house was built along them. The bricks themselves tell the same story of deliberate order. Whether fired in a kiln near Harappa or hundreds of kilometers away near Mohenjo-daro, they were made to the same ratio, 1 part thickness to 2 parts width to 4 parts length. A brick made in one city would fit, without adjustment, into a wall being built in the other. No central authority is known to have enforced this standard. No inscription survives ordering it, yet it held for centuries across an area larger than many modern nations. A builder walking into an unfamiliar town hundreds of kilometers from home would have found the bricks in the wall as familiar as the ones back home. Step inside an ordinary home along one of the lower town's lanes, and the first thing to notice is water, not its absence, but its constant, unremarkable presence. Many houses had their own well in a private courtyard. Across the city as a whole, archaeologists have counted roughly 700 wells, an extraordinary density for any ancient settlement. Bathing floors, carefully sloped and often paved with fitted brick, drained through the wall into a channel that ran beneath the street outside. A family living here in the maturity of the city, sometime after 2500 BC, would have bathed daily in a private space, using a plumbing system with more coverage than most European cities would achieve for another 3,500 years. Beneath the street itself ran the feature that most defines these cities in the eyes of anyone who studies them. A covered drain, built of fitted baked brick, running the full length of the lane and carrying wastewater away from every household connected to it. The largest of these channels measured roughly 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, lined to prevent leakage, fitted with small settling pools at intervals to trap sediment before it could clog the flow downstream. Access points, something close to an early manhole, allowed workers to lift the brick covering and clear a blockage without disturbing the street above. This was not a system built for a palace or a temple. It ran beneath the homes of ordinary families, the poorest quarters included, with the same care given to the wealthiest. A boy growing up in one of these lanes would have known this system the way any child knows the ordinary furniture of home, without wonder, because he had never known anything else. He would have watched his mother pour wastewater into the channel outside their door and heard it join the flow moving steadily towards the edge of the city. He would have played in streets that ran straight for hundreds of feet, learned the shortest route to the nearest well, and understood the rhythm of a city that had solved, generations before his birth, a problem that would still be killing people in far larger cities thousands of years later. He had no reason to think his home was remarkable. He had nothing to compare it to. Not every house was the same size, and this variation offers one of the few visible clues to how people were arranged within these cities. Some homes were modest, a handful of rooms around a small courtyard. Others sprawled across multiple stories with dozens of rooms, private wells, and space enough for both a household and whatever craft or trade sustained it. Yet the materials and construction quality remained remarkably consistent across this range. Even the smaller homes were built from the same standardized brick, connected to the same drainage network, given the same basic dignity of design. Wealth, whatever form it took here, did not appear to buy an escape from the shared standards of the city. It bought more space within them. Rising above the lower town, the citadel held the buildings that seem to have mattered most to civic life, though their exact purpose is rarely certain. Raised platforms carried structures large enough to have served administrative or communal functions, storage buildings capable of holding surplus grain for the wider population, and open spaces that may have hosted markets, gatherings, or work that required more room than any private courtyard could offer. A merchant climbing the ramp from the lower town toward the citadel would have passed from the residential rhythm of daily life into a zone built for something larger than any single household, though what exactly that something was remains, even now, a matter of careful inference rather than certainty. The scale of the labour behind all this deserves its own reckoning. Raising the citadel platform alone required moving an immense volume of earth and brick, all of it without draft animals suited to heavy hauling, without the wheel used for transport at any real scale, without machinery of any kind beyond human muscle, baskets and simple sledges. Multiply that effort across two great cities and the network of smaller towns supporting them, and the underlying question sharpens rather than fades. Who organized this labor? Who decided that a platform needed to rise here, a drain needed to run there, and convinced or compelled enough people to spend years of their lives making it happen? The bricks answer nothing about this. They only prove that someone, somehow, did. Compare this to the Mesopotamian cities rising around the same centuries, and the difference becomes sharper still. Mesopotamian cities grew organically around temple precincts, their streets narrow, winding, and irregular, shaped by centuries of ad hoc building rather than a single guiding plan. Here, the opposite pattern holds. The grid appears essentially complete from the earliest layers of the mature city, suggesting the layout was established before most of the city existed at all, rather than accumulated gradually the way older urban traditions typically grew. A visitor arriving here from a Mesopotamian city would have found the experience disorienting in its regularity, a city that felt planned in a way theirs never had been. And yet for a city this large, this organized, and this obviously the product of coordinated decision-making, one thing is conspicuously missing from the archaeological record: any structure that unambiguously served as a royal residence. No throne room has been identified, no palace complex comparable to those excavated in Mesopotamia or later dynastic Egypt has ever been found beneath either city's ruins. The citadel holds buildings of genuine importance, but none of them announce themselves, through scale or ornament, as the home of a king. For a civilization capable of this much coordinated planning, the absence is striking enough that it has shaped nearly every subsequent debate about how these cities were actually governed. Public buildings on the citadel, hint at a civic life organized around something other than individual glory. Storage structures suggest that surplus grain, once harvested, moved into some form of communal or administrative control rather than remaining entirely within individual households. Whether that grain was collected as a form of tax, pooled voluntarily for redistribution in hard seasons, or managed by merchants operating something closer to a trade guild than a government, the physical evidence cannot say. What it does suggest is a society capable of large-scale cooperation without needing to carve that cooperation into monuments celebrating any one person's role in organizing it. A merchant walking the main street towards the citadel in the late morning would have passed craftspeople working in open-fronted rooms, shaping beads from carnelian, firing small clay figures, or weighing goods on a balance calibrated to the same standard used across the entire civilization. He would have nodded to neighbors he had known his whole life, stepped carefully around a drainage access point being cleared by a city worker, and felt, without needing to articulate it, the particular calm of living in a place that worked, streets that did not flood, water that ran where it was meant to run, waste that disappeared rather than accumulated. For him, this was simply what a city was. He had no reason to imagine that most of the ancient world was, by comparison, filthy, cramped, and largely improvised. The uniformity extends even to weights and measures, a detail easy to overlook but difficult to overstate. Cubical stone weights, following a consistent binary and decimal system, have been recovered from sites separated by enormous distances, calibrated closely enough that a trader could carry goods from one city to another, confident the measures used to weigh them would match. This is not a minor administrative convenience. It implies some form of shared authority, formal or informal, capable of enforcing a standard across a territory larger than many modern countries, with no evidence of the coercive apparatus, armies, tax collectors, royal decrees, typically associated with maintaining such standards elsewhere in the ancient world. Consider what it would take for a system like this to function purely through voluntary convention rather than centralized enforcement. Merchants across dozens of cities would need to agree, generation after generation, to use the same weights, build to the same brick ratio, and maintain compatible city layouts, all without a king to punish deviation or a bureaucracy to inspect compliance. It is possible. Trade networks throughout history have sometimes maintained standards through the simple self-interest of merchants who benefit from predictability. But it is also possible that some form of authority did exist, operating through channels the archaeological record has simply failed to preserve. A governing structure invisible today because it never chose to make itself visible then. By the time these cities reached their fullest extent, sometime in the centuries after 2500 BC, they had achieved something no other Bronze Age civilization managed at a comparable scale: a standard of ordinary civic life, in sanitation, in housing, in planning, that exceeded what most of their contemporaries could offer, even their elites. A family in the lower town of either city lived with running access to clean water, a private bathroom, a drainage system that carried waste away without a second thought, and streets laid out with a logic that made the city legible to a stranger within a day of arrival. None of this required a palace to explain it. None of it required a king. But this same evidence, so persuasive as proof of sophistication, becomes genuinely difficult to interpret the moment the question turns to power. A civilization capable of coordinating brick standards across a territory the size of a modern nation was clearly capable of coordinating people. The question is how, and through whom. Every answer offered so far, a council of merchants, a religious authority operating without the monumental architecture typical elsewhere, a form of collective governance without precedent in the ancient world, remains an inference built from absence rather than a conclusion built from direct evidence. The drains and the grid prove organization. They do not prove who was doing the organizing or what happened to anyone who refused to go along with it. It is tempting, standing amid this evidence, to resolve the tension quickly, to decide that a civilization this orderly must have been peaceful, must have been fair, must have distributed its comforts and burdens with something close to equality. The temptation is understandable. It is also, on its own, unearned. Order and equality are not the same thing, and a society capable of building shared infrastructure at this scale is equally capable, in principle, of enforcing that infrastructure through hierarchy, coercion, or violence. Its material remains simply failed to preserve in a form archaeologists can read. The grid itself takes no side in this argument. It only insists that whoever built it had the authority to make thousands of individual households conform to a single plan. What can be said with real confidence is this: somewhere in the space between these two great cities, a society emerged that solved urban problems, water, waste, housing, trade, at a level of sophistication its neighbors would not match for millennia, and did so while leaving behind no palace, no throne, no image of a ruler commanding obedience. Whether that absence reflects a civilization that genuinely needed no king, or one whose king simply left no trace a modern archaeologist would recognize, is a question the bricks and drains cannot answer by themselves. Something else will have to. At the heart of the citadel in one of these cities stood a structure unlike anything else recovered from this period anywhere in the ancient world. A public building whose scale and construction suggest it mattered enormously to the people who built it, though its exact purpose has never been settled. Waterproofed with a layer of natural tar sealed between courses of fitted brick, supplied by a well, and drained through a corbelled brick culvert, it represents an investment of labour and material that only a genuinely important structure would justify. It offers, more than any other single building recovered from either city, a direct route into the question of what these people believed mattered enough to build permanently, and what role water itself played in that belief. That structure deserves its own close attention, not as one feature among many, but as the clearest surviving expression of whatever these people valued enough to spend years of collective labour building. Everything examined so far, the streets, the drains, the housing, the weights, describes a civilization organized around function. This next structure describes something closer to meaning, and following it closely offers the best chance yet of understanding what these people were actually trying to build, beyond simply a place to live. At the center of the citadel, sunk 8 feet below the level of the surrounding pavement, lies a rectangular pool roughly 40 feet long and 23 feet wide, built with a precision that borders on obsessive. The floor is laid from bricks set on edge, fitted so closely that a layer of gypsum plaster could seal every seam, and beneath that floor runs a second skin of brick, sandwiching a layer of natural bitumen, tar carried in from elsewhere and worked into the structure purely to keep water from escaping into the earth below. Steps descend into the pool from both the north and south sides, worn smooth by feet that stopped walking on them more than 3,000 years ago. Nothing about this construction was necessary for survival. It was built by people who wanted this pool to hold water for a very long time, and who were willing to spend enormous effort making sure it did. A young woman approaches the pool in the early morning, before the heat of the day settles over the citadel, and descends the southern steps into water drawn from a well in an adjoining room built specifically to feed the tank. She is not alone. Others move through the same ritual around her, some entering the water, others waiting along the brick colonnade that lines 3 sides of the pool, its columns once framed with wooden screens now long since rotted away. No one here is swimming for pleasure or bathing simply to be clean, not in the way she might wash at home. The water here means something beyond hygiene, though what exactly it means, whether purification before a ceremony, a rite tied to the changing seasons, or an act of devotion to something the archaeological record has never named, is not something she would have needed to explain to herself. She would simply have known, the way people know the meaning of rituals they were raised with. Around the pool, a series of small rooms lines the eastern edge of the complex, one of them containing the well that supplied the tank, others large enough to suggest changing spaces or quarters for whoever oversaw whatever took place here. No rainwater inlet has ever been found feeding the bath directly, which means every gallon that filled it, and it held roughly 21,000 gallons at capacity, was drawn by hand from the well and carried or channeled in. A structure demanding this much dedicated labor, this much precision, sitting at the literal high point of the city, was clearly not incidental to whatever these people valued most. The question that has occupied archaeologists since its excavation in the 1920s is what, precisely, that value was. The dominant reading, and the one repeated most often, treats the Great Bath as a site of ritual purification, water used to cleanse and renew the well-being of those who entered it, in the tradition of ceremonial bathing that would echo forward into much later religious practice across the same region. This reading rests on reasonable ground. The scale of the investment, the total absence of any comparably ambitious secular building nearby, and the later cultural importance of sacred bathing across South Asia all point in the same direction. If any single structure at Mohenjo-daro can be called religious with real confidence, this is the strongest candidate the city offers. But confidence is not the same as certainty, and in recent decades, that reading has come under closer scrutiny. Some archaeologists, including specialists who have spent careers studying the site directly, argue the surrounding buildings look less like a religious complex and more like an elite or administrative one, and point out that no clear religious iconography, no altar, no image of a deity, no unambiguous symbol of worship has ever been recovered from the structure itself. The absence cuts the same way it does everywhere else in this civilization. A ritual bath without a single surviving image of what was worshipped there is either evidence of a religion so aniconic it left nothing behind to find, or evidence that the ritual reading has simply been assumed for a century without ever being proven. Consider what the Great Bath would need to represent if it were purely religious in the way later temples across the region would be. It would likely stand alongside other unambiguously sacred structures, shrines, altars, images of gods. None of those exist here, not at this scale, not anywhere in the excavated city. Instead, the Great Bath stands essentially alone, the single most monumental structure in a civilization that otherwise built almost nothing for grandeur's sake. That isolation is either the mark of an extraordinarily singular sacred site, unlike anything else these people built, or a sign that the label placed on it by its earliest excavators has simply outlived the certainty that once justified it. What is not in dispute is the engineering achievement itself, regardless of what conclusion is drawn from its purpose. Waterproofing a structure this size using bitumen sandwiched between layers of brick, in an era without any comparable technology recorded elsewhere in the ancient world at this scale, represents a level of hydraulic sophistication that would not be widely matched again for millennia. Whoever built this had already solved elsewhere in the city the practical problems of moving and containing water at scale. The Great Bath took that solved problem and pointed it at something other than daily use, towards a purpose important enough to justify building the single most ambitious structure this civilization is known to have produced. By the time the young woman climbs the northern steps back out of the pool, water running from her shoulders onto sun-warmed brick, the ceremony, whatever it was, has done what it was built to do. She rejoins the flow of people moving through the citadel, past the well room, past the colonnade, back down towards the streets where the same water management skill runs beneath every home in the lower town. For her, the line between the sacred and the practical may never have felt as sharp as it does to someone studying the ruins 3,000 years later. The same civilization that built covered drains for ordinary households also built the most elaborate water structure in the ancient world at the peak of its citadel. Whether that continuity reflects one unified worldview about water, or two entirely separate impulses, utility and reverence, that happen to converge on the same technology, is a question the bath itself, sealed and silent, does not answer. What the Great Bath does offer, more clearly than almost anything else recovered from either city, is a warning against reading absence too quickly in either direction. For a century, its scale and prominence were taken as settled proof of a religious life organized around water and purification, a conclusion that felt obvious simply because nothing else on this scale existed to compete with it. That confidence has since softened, not because new evidence overturned it, but because closer scrutiny revealed how much of the original reading rested on assumption rather than proof. The same caution that now applies to the bath applies to nearly everything else built by these people. Scale suggests importance. It does not, on its own, explain what that importance meant. Beyond the citadel wall, that same caution will matter even more, because the questions ahead are not about what a structure meant to the people who built it, but about who those people were trading with, how far their world actually extended, and what happens when a single carved stone, the same kind pressed into clay by a merchant in a doorway, turns up not in this city, but in a foreign one, hundreds of miles across open water. A merchant loads his cart before dawn, when the air is still cool enough to work, without sweat soaking through his tunic. Bundles of cotton cloth, woven finer than anything most of his trading partners abroad have ever touched, sit stacked beside pouches of carnelian beads, polished to a deep, waxy red. He checks his stone weights against the standard every trader in the city uses, the same cubes of polished stone that a merchant in a city hundreds of kilometers away would recognize instantly. His route will take him first to the coast, to a port built with the same brick precision as his own home city, where his goods will be loaded onto a ship bound for a coastline he has never seen and a language he does not speak. That port exists, and its remains still stand today at a site called Lothal in the modern state of Gujarat. Archaeologists excavating there uncovered a dockyard, a basin built to allow ships to enter, load, and depart safely, regardless of tidal changes along the coast, an engineering achievement that required the same command of hydraulics visible in the drains and baths of the great inland cities. Around the dockyard stood workshops where artisans shaped carnelian, agate, and other semi-precious stones into beads destined for distant markets, and a marketplace where goods changed hands before ever reaching a ship. This was not an isolated fishing village pressed into service. It was a purpose-built node in a trade network stretching, by sea and by caravan, towards Mesopotamia itself. From Lothal, ships would follow the coastline west, past the Makran shore and the settlements of Oman, before entering the Persian Gulf and making landfall at cities Mesopotamian merchants had built generations earlier. Cuneiform tablets from these cities describe a distant land they called Meluha, and while no ancient dictionary survives to confirm the identification with certainty, the overwhelming scholarly consensus places Meluha in the Indus region, supported by the goods those tablets associate with it. Timber, ivory, carnelian, lapis lazuli, cotton textiles, and pearls flowed westward. Silver, tin, wool, and oil flowed back east. Two civilizations, separated by more than 1,000 kilometers of open water and hostile coastline, had built a working commercial relationship stable enough to leave records on both ends. Mesopotamian tablets go further than simply naming a trading partner. They describe interpreters employed specifically to communicate with Meluhan merchants, suggesting these were not occasional, improvised encounters between strangers, but an ongoing relationship formal enough to require dedicated linguistic support. Cylinder seals uncovered in Mesopotamian cities depict figures believed to represent these traders, and Meluhan goods appear frequently enough in temple and palace records that scholars have been able to track fluctuations in the relationship over time, including a period during the Third Dynasty around 2100 BC, when references to ships arriving from Meluha appear to drop off, hinting at a slowdown in direct contact that historians still debate the cause of. Picture the scene at a Mesopotamian dock as a Meluhan vessel arrives, its hold packed with the same cotton textiles and carved beads a merchant back home might have loaded weeks earlier. Local traders, working through an interpreter, inspect the carnelian for quality, testing its color and clarity against pieces they have handled before. A price is negotiated, likely through direct exchange of goods rather than any form of currency, since none existed in either civilization at this scale. Silver changes hands, or tin, or bundles of wool, the materials this land could offer in return for what the Indus traders had brought. Neither side fully understands the other's language, religion, or system of government. Neither needs to. The beads are real. The silver is real. The exchange works. This maritime route was only one half of the network. Overland caravans moved goods through the mountain passes towards the Iranian plateau and beyond, carrying lapis lazuli mined far to the north, turquoise, and metals not available within the river valley itself, while sending finished goods, pottery, worked stone, and textiles back in the other direction. A trader working this land route faced different hazards than his counterpart at sea: difficult terrain, unpredictable weather in the high passes, and the constant calculation of how much cargo pack animals could realistically carry across hundreds of kilometers of unforgiving ground. Between the two routes, sea and overland, this civilization had built a commercial reach extending from the Arabian Sea to the edges of Central Asia. The archaeological proof of this reach does not rest on trade goods alone. It rests, most strikingly, on the seals themselves, the small carved stones merchants used to mark ownership and authenticate shipments. These seals, along with their clay impressions, have been recovered not only across the length of the river valley, but in Mesopotamian cities, on the Persian Gulf island once known as Dilmun, and at a site called Fyalaka off the coast of modern Kuwait. A seal, carved by an artisan working near one of the great inland cities, could end up buried in the ruins of a foreign port 1,000 kilometers away, carried there by a trader whose name, language, and fate are entirely unknown, but whose presence at that distant dock is now beyond serious dispute. Standing at the heart of this network was Mohenjo-daro, a smaller settlement south of Mohenjo-daro that specialized almost entirely in craft production, particularly the manufacture of carnelian beads, through techniques requiring real technical skill, careful heating to deepen the stone's color, and precise drilling with tools fine enough not to shatter it. A site like this did not need the scale of a Mohenjo-daro to matter economically. It needed specialization, and it needed a reliable connection to the trade routes that would carry its output outward, first to the great cities of the valley itself, and from there, potentially, all the way to a temple storeroom in Mesopotamia. Consider what this network required to function at all, set against everything already established about how these cities were organized. Trade at this scale, spanning thousands of kilometers, multiple languages, and years-long round trips by sea, does not typically survive on individual goodwill alone. It usually depends on some form of institutional backing, whether that takes the shape of merchant guilds capable of enforcing agreements, a governing authority guaranteeing the value of goods and the safety of routes, or simply deeply embedded convention strong enough to substitute for formal enforcement. Whichever explanation is correct, it points again toward the same unresolved question raised by the cities themselves. Something was coordinating an enormous amount of activity across an enormous territory, and it left no name behind. A woman working the bead furnaces at Mohenjo-daro would have known none of the merchants who eventually carried her work across the sea. She would have known only the rhythm of her craft, heating stone to the precise point that would deepen its color without cracking it, drilling a hole through material harder than most tools of her era should have been able to manage, packaging finished beads for traders who arrived, collected the goods, and moved on towards the coast. Her work would outlive her by 4,000 years, surfacing eventually in the ruins of a Mesopotamian city she never saw, evidence of a connection she almost certainly never fully understood the scope of. It is worth pausing on how strange this asymmetry actually is. Mesopotamian records name their trading partner, describe the goods exchanged, even hint at diplomatic or commercial protocols surrounding the relationship. Nothing comparable survives from the other side. No Indus text has ever been found describing Mesopotamia, describing the sea route, describing the merchants who made these journeys or the profits, risks, and dangers involved. The civilization that built the ships, trained the sailors, and produced the goods that made this entire network worth Mesopotamia's trouble to record, left behind no written account of its own half of the story. The silence that defines so much of this civilization's internal life extends, it turns out, to its external relationships as well. By the height of this trade network, sometime in the centuries after 2500 BC, goods from this single river valley had reached temple storerooms in market stalls in cities along the Persian Gulf, and workshops as far as the edges of Central Asia. This was not an isolated agricultural society, occasionally bartering with its nearest neighbors. It was a civilization operating one end of what some archaeologists now describe as a genuine interaction sphere, a connected Bronze Age world spanning thousands of kilometers, in which this river valley functioned as a major supplier of luxury goods to some of the most powerful cities on Earth. And at the center of every transaction in that network, binding a merchant's identity to his goods across a distance he would never personally travel, sat the seal, carved from soft steatite, fired to harden it, pressed into wet clay to leave behind a mark that authenticated a shipment thousands of kilometers from its origin. The seal was this civilization's signature technology for trust at a distance. It carried, alongside its carved animal, a short line of symbols repeated across thousands of surviving examples, symbols that clearly meant something specific to the people who carved and read them. No one alive today can read a single one of those symbols with certainty. This is the second great silence at the heart of this civilization, distinct from but closely related to the silence surrounding its governance. A civilization sophisticated enough to run a trade network spanning the Arabian Sea, precise enough to standardize weights across a territory the size of a modern nation, wrote constantly, on seals, on tablets, on pottery, and left behind, by conservative counts, several thousand surviving inscriptions. And after a full century of dedicated scholarly effort, not one of those inscriptions has been definitively translated. That failure is not for lack of trying, and understanding why it has resisted solution for so long requires looking directly at the script itself, at what a century of careful analysis has managed to establish about it, and at exactly what is missing that has kept even the most rigorous attempts from crossing the line between informed hypothesis and genuine decipherment. Take one of the surviving seals and turn it over in your hand, a small square of steatite, soft enough to carve easily, fired afterwards to harden it into something closer to stone. On its face, an animal, most often a creature resembling a unicorn, that appears on far more surviving seals than any other single image, though what that animal represented to the person who carved it remains entirely unknown. Above the animal runs a short line of symbols, rarely more than a handful, occasionally stretching to a dozen or more on the longest surviving examples. The line is precise, deliberate, clearly meaningful to whoever carved it, and after a century of dedicated study by professional linguists and archaeologists, no one can say with confidence what a single one of those symbols means. The scale of the problem is easy to underestimate until the numbers are laid out plainly. Several thousand inscriptions have survived across the length of the civilization's territory, most of them on seals and their clay impressions, though examples also appear on small tablets, pottery, and occasionally on metal. Scholars working from these inscriptions have identified somewhere in the range of 400 distinct signs, depending on which classification system is used, a number that rules out a simple alphabet immediately, since alphabets typically operate with a few dozen letters at most. It also rules out a system where each sign represents a single word, since a functioning language generally requires far more than 400 words to operate. That range points towards something in between, a logosyllabic system most likely, in which some signs represent whole words or ideas, and others represent syllables or sounds, similar in structure to ancient Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, or the writing systems later developed in Mesoamerica. What makes this identification frustrating rather than clarifying is the brevity of what survives. The average inscription runs only about 5 signs long. The single longest inscription ever recovered contains 26 signs, and it stands alone as an outlier. Nearly everything else is shorter, often dramatically so. Compare this to the kind of extended narrative texts that helped scholars crack other ancient scripts, royal decrees, religious texts, administrative records running to hundreds or thousands of signs, and the scale of the challenge becomes clear. Imagine trying to reconstruct an unknown language using only the text found on coins and name tags. Never a sentence, never a paragraph, only short strings of symbols that were never meant to carry a story. Some patterns have emerged despite this brevity, and they matter because they prove the script follows real rules rather than existing as decoration or random marking. The writing runs predominantly from right to left, a conclusion drawn largely from a simple but elegant piece of physical evidence. On inscriptions carved into a limited space, the symbols towards the end of the line become visibly cramped, squeezed closer together as the carver ran out of room, exactly the way handwriting compresses when a person realizes too late that a line is running out of space. Because that compression consistently appears on the left side of these inscriptions, scholars concluded the carving began on the right and moved leftward. On longer texts, some inscriptions even alternate direction line by line, a technique called boustrophodon, meaning literally the turning of the ox, describing the back and forth path a plough follows across a field. A scribe working 4,000 years ago, carving a short inscription into a tablet or a seal, would have followed conventions so deeply internalized they required no conscious thought, beginning on the right, working left, compressing the final signs if space ran short, exactly as a person writing quickly today might let their handwriting shrink towards the edge of a page. That scribe had no way of knowing that 4,000 years later, strangers speaking languages that did not yet exist would study the spacing of those final cramped signs as their primary evidence for which direction an entire civilization's writing system moved. The most mundane habit of a Bronze Age craftsman became, millennia later, one of the only solid facts available about an entire lost system of thought. Further patterns emerge from the statistical analysis of sign sequences across thousands of surviving inscriptions. Certain signs reliably appear together in fixed pairs or clusters. Certain signs appear almost exclusively at the beginning of an inscription, others almost exclusively at the end, in patterns closely resembling how a functioning language organizes prefixes, suffixes, or grammatical markers. One particular jar-shaped sign appears with unusual frequency at the very end of Indus inscriptions, leading some researchers to suggest it may function something like a final marker, comparable to a full stop closing a sentence. None of this proves what the language said. It proves, convincingly, that whatever the language was, it followed consistent internal rules, the signature of genuine writing, rather than purely decorative or symbolic marking, with no linguistic structure behind it. One especially striking piece of evidence comes not from the river valley itself, but from Mesopotamia, where Indus-style seals and their impressions have also turned up. In the valley, the jar-shaped ending sign discussed above appears once at the close of an inscription, consistent with its likely role as a terminal marker. But on certain examples found in Mesopotamia, that same sign appears twice in a row at the end of the inscription, a pattern never seen on inscriptions found within the valley itself. Some scholars have proposed a compelling explanation, that Mesopotamian scribes, unfamiliar with the finer conventions of a script they had adopted to record their own separate language, may have doubled the marker by mistake, the ancient equivalent of a foreign speaker misapplying a grammatical rule they only partially understood. If correct, it would mean the Indus script was, at least occasionally, being used by people who did not speak whatever language it was originally built to record, evidence of the same cross-cultural contact already established through trade goods and cylinder seals. Despite these patterns, the central obstacle to full decipherment has never budged. No one knows what language the script represents. Scholars have proposed connections to nearly every major language family with a plausible geographic or historical claim. Early Dravidian languages, since related languages are still spoken across much of southern India today, early Indo-Aryan tongues, and various now extinct language families, with no surviving modern descendants at all. Each proposal carries some circumstantial support. None has achieved anything close to consensus. Deciphering a script requires, at minimum, an educated guess about which sounds the symbols are meant to represent. And without knowing the underlying language, that guess remains exactly that, a guess, however sophisticated the reasoning behind it. The comparison that clarifies exactly what is missing here is Egyptian hieroglyphs, a script that puzzled scholars for centuries with no more success than the Indus script has managed, until a single archaeological discovery changed everything. In 1799, a stone slab was uncovered bearing the same decree carved 3 times, once in hieroglyphic Egyptian, once in a simplified everyday Egyptian script, and once in ancient Greek, a language scholars already read fluently. That stone, the Rosetta Stone, functioned as a translation key, allowing researchers to work outward from the known Greek text and systematically match its meaning against the unknown Egyptian symbols beside it. Within roughly 2 decades of its discovery, Egyptian hieroglyphs, silent for well over 1,000 years, could be read again. No comparable stone has ever surfaced for this script, and there is real reason to doubt one ever will. A bilingual key requires that the civilization in question wrote the same text in 2 languages side by side, typically for the practical benefit of a multilingual population or a foreign administration. Nothing in the archaeological record suggests this civilization ever felt that need, and the sheer brevity of every surviving inscription, none of them ever a formal decree or lengthy proclamation of the kind Egypt and Mesopotamia both produced in abundance, makes the survival of such a text, even if one once existed, statistically unlikely. Every scholar working on this script today is, in effect, attempting the work that took Egyptologists 2 decades, without ever having found their Rosetta Stone, and with a fraction of the raw text length to work from. More than 100 formal attempts at decipherment have been published across the past century, and this number itself tells its own story. Proposals have linked the script to Sumerian, to various strands of Indo-European, to a lost language family with no other known trace, and, in recent years, to computational approaches using statistical modeling and pattern recognition to search for structure the human eye might miss. None of these attempts has achieved the kind of broad, durable scholarly acceptance that would mark a genuine decipherment. Some have been persuasively challenged and abandoned. Others remain open, defended by their proponents, contested by nearly everyone else. The field has not stopped trying. It has simply not yet succeeded, and there is no way to know whether the next attempt or the next century of attempts will finally break through. It is worth sitting honestly with what this silence actually costs, beyond the simple frustration of an unsolved puzzle. Every other major Bronze Age civilization whose writing has been recovered, Egypt, Mesopotamia, later Mesoamerica, speaks to historians directly, through king lists, religious texts, legal codes, personal letters, trade records, temple inscriptions boasting of conquest, or piety, or wealth. Historians studying those civilizations know the names of actual rulers, actual gods, actual laws. Here, none of that exists. Every name given to this civilization's cities, structures, and even the civilization itself is a modern label, assigned by archaeologists working from geography or convenience, rather than anything the people who lived here ever called themselves. This absence reaches directly back into every question already raised. Was this a peaceful, egalitarian society, or a stratified one, with hierarchies simply invisible in the archaeological record? Was the Great Bath a site of religious devotion, or an elite administrative space with no religious function at all? Who organized the labor that built these cities, and through what authority? In any other major Bronze Age civilization, written records would offer at least partial answers to questions like these: a king's boast, a temple's inventory, a scribe's private complaint. Here, the seals that might have carried those answers sit in museum cases around the world, their short lines of symbols fully visible, fully photographed, fully catalogued, and utterly silent. That silence is not a gap waiting patiently to be filled. It is the defining condition under which every claim about this civilization, peaceful or violent, egalitarian or stratified, religious or secular, has had to be built entirely from what these people did rather than anything they ever said. The walls they built, the weapons they carried, the graves they dug for their dead, all of it becomes far more consequential once the possibility of a written record settling the argument is finally set aside. The evidence that remains is no longer supporting testimony. It is the only testimony there will ever be, and it is time to examine, without the comfort of a written record to fall back on, exactly what it says about who governed this civilization, and how. Walk through the excavated ruins of either great city and search deliberately for the one thing nearly every other ancient civilization left behind in abundance: a palace. Look for thick defensive walls surrounding a residence larger than any other in the settlement, for a throne room, for private quarters built to separate a ruler from the rest of the population by more than simple distance. It is not there, not at Mohenjo-daro, not at Harappa, not at any of the hundreds of smaller sites excavated across this civilization's territory in a century of dedicated archaeological work. The buildings on the citadel are large, clearly important, clearly the product of significant resources and planning. None of them announces itself, through scale, ornament, or function, as the home of a king. The same search, extended to tombs, produces the same result. No burial anywhere in the excavated territory approaches the scale of a Mesopotamian royal tomb, where a single monarch's death might be accompanied by dozens of sacrificed attendants and treasures meant to signal wealth beyond any ordinary person's imagining. No burial approaches the scale of an Egyptian tomb, built to outlast the ruler it housed by thousands of years. Instead, cemetery after cemetery reveals rectangular pits, bodies laid on their backs along a consistent north-south axis, accompanied by a modest scatter of pottery, occasionally ornaments, rarely anything that would mark the occupant as fundamentally different in status from the neighbors buried beside them. One cemetery, excavated at a site called Mehrgarh, illustrates the pattern with particular clarity. The graves found there are, by the standards of comparable Bronze Age burials elsewhere, humble. Exotic objects, inscribed seals, or anything resembling ritual regalia have essentially never turned up inside a Harappan period grave. A small number of graves show signs of slightly elevated treatment, bodies laid on a bed of pottery vessels, or graves lined with brick rather than simply dug into the earth. But even these marked distinctions remain modest, a difference of degree rather than the vast gulf in treatment that separates a peasant's grave from a king's tomb in nearly every other major civilization of this period. Picture a family gathered at the edge of one such cemetery, preparing to bury an elder who has died after a long life. The pit is dug carefully, its sides cut clean and vertical, oriented the same way every other grave in this ground has been oriented for generations. Pottery vessels are placed beside the body, food and drink for whatever comes after death, along with perhaps a few personal ornaments the deceased wore in life. There is no monument planned, no inscription commissioned, nothing that will mark this grave as more significant than the one beside it, dug the previous season for someone else's grandmother. If status shaped this ritual at all, it shaped it quietly, in the number of pots rather than the presence of a throne carved from stone. The most direct visual evidence anyone has ever offered for what a ruler here might have looked like is a small steatite statue, excavated from a room at Mohenjo-daro in 1927, standing barely 7 inches tall and recovered in 2 pieces. The figure sits with a neatly trimmed beard, eyes half closed in an expression some have read as meditative, wearing a cloak draped over one shoulder and decorated with a trefoil pattern, originally filled with red pigment. A fillet band circles the head, and holes beneath the ears suggest some further ornament, perhaps a headdress, was once attached but has not survived. Early excavator John Marshall, encountering the statue's dignified bearing, proposed it depicted a king-priest. Mortimer Wheeler later inverted the phrase, and the name priest-king has stuck in popular use ever since. The name, however, has far outlived the confidence that originally produced it. Modern specialists studying the statue directly describe the title as speculative, resting almost entirely on the figure's posture and dress, rather than any secure evidence connecting it to actual political or religious authority. The statue was recovered broken, from an uncertain context, with no inscription identifying who or what it represents. It could depict a real ruler, it could depict a priest with no political power at all, it could depict a deity, an ancestor, or a stylized ideal with no single real-world referent whatsoever. Scholars today generally treat the priest-king less as a confirmed historical figure and more as a single, ambiguous artifact that early 20th century assumptions about what obviously looked like authority pushed toward a far more confident label than the evidence has ever actually supported. Set against this near-total absence of monumental authority, the physical texture of ordinary housing reinforces the same picture. Across excavated residential areas at Mohenjo-daro, home sizes cluster within a relatively narrow range, typically between roughly 100 and 200 square meters, without the extreme outliers that would signal a small elite living in radically different conditions from everyone else. Private wells and bathrooms appear across a wide range of household sizes, not concentrated exclusively among a handful of obviously wealthy residences. Craft production, similarly, shows no clear evidence of monopoly control by an elite class, no sign that bead-making or metalworking was restricted to workshops attached to a ruling family, rather than distributed more broadly across the population. Taken together, this evidence has led a genuine and serious body of scholarship to conclude that this civilization may represent something close to a historical anomaly, a large, urbanized, technologically sophisticated Bronze Age society that functioned without the concentrated, hereditary, monumentally visible authority that defined essentially every other civilization operating at a comparable scale during this period. Not a society without any organization. The standardized bricks and citywide drainage systems rule that possibility out entirely, but one whose organization may have operated through mechanisms genuinely different from kingship, perhaps a council of merchants, a rotating or collective form of civic authority, or some structure archaeology has simply not yet found a way to detect. A trader arriving at the citadel to settle a dispute over a shipment of carnelian beads would have had somewhere to bring his complaint, some structure of authority capable of enforcing the weight standards, the property claims, and the trade agreements that clearly held across this civilization for centuries. Whether that authority took the form of a single respected individual, a council of senior merchants, or some form of collective civic body meeting in one of the large buildings on the citadel, he would have known exactly where to go and whose word would settle the matter. That certainty, so basic to daily life, is precisely what the archaeological record has never been able to reconstruct with confidence, 4,000 years later. This is where the egalitarian reading of this civilization finds its strongest footing, and it deserves to be stated in its full strength before any complication is introduced. No palace, no royal tomb, no unambiguous portrait of a named ruler, housing that clusters within a narrow range, rather than sprawling into visible extremes of wealth and poverty. Burials that vary modestly in the goods they contain, but never approach the staggering inequality documented in contemporary Mesopotamian and Egyptian tombs. If any large Bronze Age civilization managed to build cities at genuine scale, while avoiding the concentration of power into visible monumentalized kingship, the physical evidence recovered so far makes the strongest possible case that it was this one. Consider what this would mean if the egalitarian reading holds. Every other Bronze Age civilization studied in comparable depth, Mesopotamia's competing city-states, Egypt's unified dynastic kingdom, later Mesoamerica's ceremonial centers, organized its labor, its trade, and its cities around some form of concentrated authority, typically religious, typically hereditary, typically visible in exactly the kind of monument this civilization never built. If this civilization achieved comparable scale and sophistication through a genuinely different organizing principle, It would stand as one of the most significant counterexamples in the entire history of early urbanism, proof that cities, drainage, standardized trade, and coordinated labor do not, in fact, require a king to make them work. It is worth dwelling on how radical that possibility actually is, set against the assumptions built into most modern thinking about how complex societies form. The instinctive assumption, reinforced by nearly every other ancient civilization studied in detail, is that scale requires hierarchy, that someone, somewhere, must be giving the orders that get an aqueduct built or a trade network coordinated. If this civilization built cities at this level of sophistication without that concentrated authority, it suggests the relationship between scale and hierarchy is not as inevitable as it appears from looking at Egypt, Mesopotamia, or nearly anywhere else. It suggests cooperation at civilizational scale might be achievable through consensus, convention, and shared culture alone. But there is a reason this remains a live, scholarly debate rather than a settled conclusion, and it begins with a simple observation about the seals themselves. The same small carved stones, already established as central to this civilization's trade network. Their designs are not random. The animals depicted on them follow consistent patterns, the unicorn-like creature appearing on a striking majority of all known examples, other animals, tigers, elephants, water buffalo, appearing with far less frequency. Some scholars have proposed that this consistency reflects something more than decorative preference, that it may signal group identity, occupational guild membership, or some form of social categorization operating beneath the surface of the archaeological record. If that reading is correct, then the seals themselves may represent exactly the kind of stratification that housing and burial evidence otherwise fails to show. A trader carrying a unicorn seal might have belonged to a specific merchant association, distinct from and potentially ranked differently against traders carrying seals marked with other animals. The scarcity of certain animal types relative to others could reflect the relative size or prestige of different social or occupational groups, information invisible in a family's home or grave, but encoded, if this interpretation holds, directly into the objects they use to conduct business every day of their working lives. This possibility deserves real weight, and not simply as a stubborn holdout against an otherwise persuasive egalitarian case. A society can maintain remarkably uniform housing and modest burial practices while still operating a functioning, even rigid system of rank, if that system expresses itself through channels archaeology struggles to detect, control over trade routes, membership in specific crafts or guilds, ritual privilege, or simply social deference that leaves no durable physical trace at all. The absence of a palace proves this civilization did not organize its hierarchy the way Mesopotamia or Egypt did. It does not, by itself, prove no hierarchy existed. A merchant pressing his personal seal into wet clay to authenticate a shipment may have been doing something far more socially loaded than simply marking ownership. If the animal on that seal signaled his membership in a particular trade association, his standing within it, or his family's historical position in the city's commercial life, then every sealed shipment carried an unspoken social message alongside its practical one, legible to every other trader in the network in a way that is now, without the ability to read the accompanying script, almost entirely lost to modern eyes examining the same object 4,000 years later. What remains true, regardless of which reading eventually gains the stronger footing, is that this civilization solved the practical problems of coordinated labor, standardized trade, and city-wide infrastructure at a scale matched by very few of its contemporaries, and did so while leaving behind essentially none of the monumental self-glorification that nearly every other comparably sized ancient society considered almost automatic. Whether that reflects the presence of a genuinely different kind of authority, quieter, more distributed, expressed through trade networks and seals rather than palaces and tombs, or the near-total absence of concentrated authority altogether, the physical record simply does not resolve with certainty. What can be said, and what the next body of evidence will complicate further, is that the picture built so far, orderly cities, modest graves, no visible king, has described only half of what has been recovered from these ruins. There is another category of evidence, one this account has deliberately set aside, until now, that does not fit comfortably into the portrait of a uniform, cooperative, quietly egalitarian society. It concerns not how these people organized their trade or buried their dead, but what they kept, in surprising quantity, inside their own homes. Return to the same lower town household already walked through twice now, the same courtyard, the same private well, the same drainage channel running beneath the street outside. Look this time not at the architecture but at what sits inside a storage room near the kitchen. A small stone axe head, its blade thin and unadorned, sitting beside a set of grinding stones and a stack of pottery. Nothing about this object marks it as a soldier's possession, kept apart in some dedicated armory, or displayed as a symbol of status. It sits among the ordinary tools of daily domestic life, exactly where a family might keep anything else they used regularly and without particular ceremony. This placement matters enormously to how these objects have been interpreted. Across sites throughout this civilization's territory, between roughly 30 and 50% of all recovered metal artifacts fall into a category that could reasonably be classified as either tools or weapons. Axes, spears, arrowheads, blades, made primarily of copper and bronze. In many other Bronze Age cultures, comparable objects are found concentrated in specific, socially meaningful contexts, buried alongside warriors in dedicated graves, stored in structures resembling armories, displayed in ways that clearly separate them from the ordinary equipment of daily domestic life. Here, they overwhelmingly turn up scattered through ordinary homes, the same rooms that held cooking pots and grinding stones, indistinguishable in their storage context from any other household implement. Early excavators drew a specific conclusion from this pattern, one that shaped how this civilization would be described for the better part of a century. If these objects were kept casually, alongside domestic tools rather than isolated as dedicated military equipment, then perhaps this civilization simply did not think of them as weapons of war at all, but as general-purpose tools, useful for a range of everyday tasks, and never primarily intended for combat. Combined with their relatively simple, unspecialized design, compared to weapons recovered from contemporary Mesopotamian sites, this reading supported one of the most widely repeated claims about this civilization, that it may have been genuinely, unusually peaceful. That reading has come under sustained and increasingly persuasive challenge in recent decades. The objects being dismissed as too simple to function as weapons are, on closer examination, still lethal instruments regardless of how plain their design happens to be. A bronze axe needs no elaborate ornamentation or specialized socket to be lethal in a fight. Comparative analysis has shown that the blade thickness on many of these tools closely matches weapons recovered from Near Eastern sites that no one seriously disputes were used in warfare. Simplicity of design, it turns out, says considerably less about function than earlier excavators assumed. The domestic storage context, once treated as evidence these objects were not weapons, admits an equally plausible alternative reading. In a society where formal, dedicated military architecture, barracks, armories, standing garrisons appears to be genuinely absent from the archaeological record, it may simply mean that armed defense of home and family was organized at the household level rather than through anything resembling a professional standing army. A family that kept a weapon in the same room as its grinding stones may not have believed the object was harmless. It may have believed, quite reasonably, that the most likely place they would ever need to use it was their own home. Picture the same household from another angle, now imagining a threat rather than routine domestic labor. A man reaches for the same axe he might otherwise use for ordinary cutting tasks, not because his city maintains no soldiers, but because in this particular structure of society, the responsibility for defending a household may have rested with the household itself, rather than a dedicated military class living apart in barracks the archaeological record has simply failed to preserve. The weapon's presence in a kitchen does not prove this civilization avoided violence. It may prove only that violence here, when it arrived, was met by ordinary people rather than professional soldiers. This same reconsideration extends directly to the human remains recovered from these cities. At Harappa, examination of skeletal material has documented injuries to a striking proportion of recovered skulls, cranial trauma consistent with blows from blunt or edged weapons rather than accidental injury from a fall or workplace accident. The sample size involved is genuinely small relative to the total population that once lived and died across this civilization's multi-century span, and any single set of skeletal remains carries real interpretive limits. But a meaningfully elevated rate of head trauma, appearing consistently across multiple excavated burial contexts, is difficult to reconcile comfortably with a picture of uniformly peaceful daily life. Consider what these two threads of evidence look like once set beside each other rather than examined in isolation. Weapons distributed through ordinary homes by the thousand, skeletal remains showing a real, if modest, rate of violent trauma. Neither piece of evidence, on its own, proves organized warfare on the scale seen in contemporary Mesopotamia, with its city-states locked in generational conflict and its inscriptions boasting openly of conquest. But together, they make the claim of a uniquely peaceful civilization considerably harder to sustain than the earliest excavators, working from incomplete evidence, and in some cases, a clear desire to find something exceptional, originally believed. The seals re-enter this discussion here as well, from a different angle than governance alone. If the animal motifs carved into these small stones did signal something like guild membership or group identity, as some scholars have proposed, that same structure could equally have organized something closer to competing interest groups, trade associations whose members might, on occasion, have come into real conflict with one another over routes, resources, or standing, disputes that a small stone carved with a unicorn or a water buffalo would never record for a future archaeologist to recover. A woman walking through the lower town in the late afternoon, passing the household with its axe stored quietly beside the grinding stones, would not have experienced her city primarily through the lens of danger. The overwhelming physical evidence recovered from these ruins still describes decades and generations of stable, functioning urban life, reliable drainage, consistent trade, standardized weights honored across enormous distances, weapons stored casually in a home, and a documented rate of violent skeletal trauma do not overturn that picture entirely. They complicate it, insisting that whatever peace this civilization achieved was not the peace of a society that had somehow transcended the need for weapons altogether, but something closer to ordinary human life, mostly calm, occasionally violent, the way most stable societies throughout history have actually functioned. This complication matters because of exactly how much weight the peaceful reading has carried in popular accounts of this civilization for the better part of a century. It is one thing to say a society avoided the specific monumentalized warfare culture visible in Mesopotamian art and inscription, no carved scenes of kings standing over defeated enemies, no boastful victory inscriptions. It is a considerably stronger and less supportable claim to say that society experienced no meaningful violence at all. The evidence recovered from ordinary homes and ordinary graves increasingly supports the first claim, while actively undermining the second. What emerges from setting the seals, the burials, the weapons, and the trauma evidence side by side is not a clean resolution in either direction, but a genuinely difficult, still open question that serious scholars continue to argue in professional journals rather than agree on informally over the course of a conference dinner. Was this a fundamentally egalitarian society that experienced ordinary, low-level domestic violence, the kind present in virtually every human community across history, without ever developing organized warfare or hereditary military rule? Or was it a more stratified society than its housing and burial evidence initially suggests? One whose hierarchy expressed itself through trade networks, seal ownership, and group identity rather than palaces, and whose conflicts, when they occurred, left traces in skulls rather than inscriptions. Neither reading can currently claim to have closed the case, and the honest scholarly position uncomfortable as it may be for anyone hoping for a tidy conclusion, is that both remain live possibilities supported by real evidence and contested by other real evidence. What has changed decisively over the past several decades is the confidence with which anyone can still claim this was simply, straightforwardly, a peaceful civilization. That confidence, built largely on the absence of certain kinds of evidence, palaces, elaborate weapons, monumental war art, has eroded steadily as archaeologists have looked more carefully at what actually was left behind, rather than simply cataloguing what was not. The next body of evidence moves this question outward, from the objects found inside individual homes to the structures built around entire cities, walls raised at enormous cost in labor and material, for a purpose that, like nearly everything else examined so far, was never explained in writing, and has instead had to be argued from the shape, placement, and construction of the walls themselves. Approach any of the major cities of this civilization, and, before reaching a single street or drainage channel, a visitor first has to pass through a wall, not a token boundary marking the edge of settlement, but a substantial structure, in places measuring as much as 12 meters thick, built from mud brick and at some sites reinforced with fired brick and stone. These walls do not simply enclose the citadel, the raised platform holding the city's most important public buildings. In many settlements, they surround the lower town as well, wrapping the entire population, elite and ordinary resident alike, inside a single continuous barrier. The most straightforward explanation, and the one favored for decades by many excavators, treats these walls as flood infrastructure rather than military architecture. The river system feeding this civilization flooded seasonally and sometimes catastrophically, and a wall doubling as a retaining structure, holding back rising water, while the raised citadel platform kept the city's most vital buildings above the floodline, would represent an entirely sensible engineering response to the environment these people actually lived in. Tapered embankments found along some outer walls, built specifically to withstand water pressure and erosion, support exactly this reading in at least some locations. But flood control alone struggles to account for everything found built into these same walls. At Harappa, bastions, projecting sections of wall specifically designed to allow defenders to see and strike along the wall's face, rather than only straight ahead, appear at regular intervals, alongside a main gateway complex, flanked by guard rooms, and approached by a ramp built to control and funnel movement, rather than simply provide access. None of this design serves a flood wall's purpose. A structure meant only to hold back rising water has no need for guard rooms positioned to observe who is entering, or bastions positioned to give an advantage against attackers rather than floodwater. Consider the deliberate choice embedded in this kind of gateway design. A flood barrier can be a simple, continuous wall, its only job to stay standing against water pressure. A gateway with guard rooms, a controlled ramp, and bastions positioned for sightlines along the approach represents a completely different category of engineering problem, one concerned with regulating and, if necessary, resisting the movement of people rather than water. Whoever designed this entrance at Harappa was thinking about what happens when someone the city does not want to admit tries to come in. The site of Surkotada in the Kutch region sharpens this picture further. Excavations there revealed a fortified citadel connected to a separately walled residential area, the two sections divided by a shared wall, roughly 7 meters thick, with a single controlled opening between them. The citadel's entrance included a ramp, a barbican, a set of defensive steps, and dedicated guard rooms, a complex of features whose combined purpose is difficult to explain through flood management alone. A barbican in particular, an outer defensive structure built specifically to protect a gateway and control access to it, is a feature associated with military architecture across numerous ancient cultures, rarely if ever built purely to manage rainwater. At Dolavira, the largest and arguably most elaborate of all excavated Harappan sites, the fortification scheme reaches a level of complexity that makes the purely defensive reading even harder to dismiss. Multiple walls divide the city into distinct fortified sections, a citadel, a middle town and a lower town, each separately enclosed, alongside an outer perimeter wall surrounding the entire settlement. This nested, multi-layered defensive arrangement, sometimes described as involving what amounts to separate fortified compounds within a single city, goes well beyond what any flood control rationale would require. A single strong outer wall, properly engineered, can hold back a flood. Building 3 or 4 separate defensive rings, one inside another, suggests a concern with controlling movement and access at multiple internal levels, not simply keeping the whole city dry. A guard standing watch at one of Sir Katada's gateway steps, looking out from behind the wall's protection toward the open plain beyond, would have understood his position the way any sentry throughout history understands a defended threshold, as the line between the protected interior of his community and whatever might approach it from outside. Whether that threat was ever realized in his lifetime, whether he ever had cause to raise an alarm, the architecture around him was built with that possibility in mind. Walls, ramps, and guard rooms of this specific configuration are not typically built by people who have never considered the need to keep someone out. It is worth being precise about what this evidence does and does not establish, because the walls alone cannot prove that organized warfare between rival cities was a regular feature of life here. What they do establish, at multiple sites and through multiple independent lines of construction detail, gateways, bastions, guard rooms, barbicans, is that whoever built these defenses was seriously concerned with controlling who could enter a settlement and under what circumstances. That concern could reflect anxiety about raiding, about conflict between rival towns or trade networks, about controlling and taxing trade passing through the gate, or some combination of motives that a single wall's stones cannot separate out for a modern excavator to weigh individually. This is precisely the point where the older, purely peaceful reading of this civilization runs into its most direct physical challenge. A society with no need for defense, genuinely free of the threat or practice of organized violence, has little reason to invest the enormous labor required to build walls 12 meters thick, complete with bastions and controlled guarded gateways, repeated at site after site across hundreds of kilometers. The scale and specific design of these fortifications, echoed independently at Harappa, Surkotada, and Dolavira, argue for a civilization that took the possibility of hostile intrusion seriously enough to build permanent, substantial architecture against it, whatever the precise nature and frequency of the threat actually was. And yet the flood control reading has not been fully displaced either, and honesty requires holding both possibilities together rather than discarding one for the sake of a cleaner story. Some walls in some locations plainly served water management functions. The tapered embankments at certain sites make that clear beyond real dispute. It is entirely possible, even likely, that a single wall served multiple purposes simultaneously, holding back floodwater in the rainy season, while also controlling and monitoring who passed through the city's gates the rest of the year. Exactly the kind of practical, multi-purpose engineering a resourceful and organized civilization would be expected to produce. What the walls ultimately offer is not a verdict but a genuine crack in the foundation of the peaceful civilization narrative. The first piece of physical evidence examined so far that actively resists an entirely peaceful reading rather than simply remaining ambiguous about it. A guard room built beside a controlled gateway ramp is difficult to explain as anything other than a response to the possibility that someone might need to be stopped from entering. Whether that possibility was realized often, rarely, or only ever in careful anticipation of a threat that never fully materialized, the wall itself still had to be built, brick, by people who judged the risk worth the effort. That judgment becomes considerably easier to understand once the objects actually found behind these walls are examined directly. Not the architecture built to keep danger out, but the tools kept close at hand inside, in case danger found its way in regardless. Inside a modest home in the lower town, in a storage room barely large enough to turn around in, A bronze axe head rests against the wall beside a stack of grinding stones. Its blade is thin, unadorned, showing none of the elaborate shaping or ornamental socket seen on weapons recovered from contemporary sites in Mesopotamia. To an excavator encountering an object like this for the first time, nearly a century ago, its plainness read as evidence of harmlessness, a farming implement mistaken, perhaps too generously, for a weapon of war. That assumption shaped how an entire civilization would be described for generations. It has not held up well against closer scrutiny. The scale of what has actually been recovered complicates that early assumption considerably. Across excavated sites throughout this civilization's territory, somewhere between 30 and 50% of all metal artifacts fall into a category that could reasonably be classified as either tool or weapon. Axes, spears, arrowheads, and blades, made from copper and bronze. This is not a marginal category of rare finds, tucked away in a handful of exceptional sites. It represents a substantial fraction of the metalwork this civilization produced, and it turns up not concentrated in specialized armories or warrior burials, but scattered through the ordinary domestic spaces of homes across the lower towns of nearly every major settlement excavated. Set this material directly against comparable weapons from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the plainness earlier scholars took as proof of harmlessness starts to look considerably less persuasive. Bronze Age Egyptian axes remained largely unsocketed, similarly simple in construction, well into a period when no serious historian disputes that Egyptian society engaged in organized, large-scale warfare. Simplicity of design, it turns out, correlates poorly with a weapon's actual lethality or its intended function. A thin, unadorned bronze blade will still cause a fatal wound as effectively as an elaborately decorated one. Ornamentation reflects status and craft tradition. It does not determine whether an edge can kill. A father in one of these households, reaching for that same plain axe head during an ordinary morning, might use it that day to cut wood, to butcher an animal, to clear brush from a family plot, its blade serving whatever practical task the day required. But if trouble ever came to his door, a raid, a dispute with a neighbor escalated past words, an intrusion through the very gates and walls already established as built with real defensive intent, that same axe would have been the object closest at hand, the tool he reached for, not because his city maintained a standing garrison to protect him, but because, in a settlement seemingly without one, defense of the home may have rested with the household itself. This reframing matters because it resolves an apparent contradiction that troubled earlier interpretations. If these cities built serious defensive walls, as the previous evidence established, yet show no clear archaeological trace of a professional standing military, no barracks, no dedicated armory, no warrior class distinguished through specialized burial or equipment, where did the manpower to defend those walls actually come from? The weapons scattered through ordinary homes suggest an answer, not a professional soldier class, but ordinary residents, farmers, craftspeople, traders, expected and equipped to defend their own walls and their own households when the need arose. Their axes and spears stored beside the same tools they used for entirely peaceful daily labor, because, in a very real sense, those tools served both purposes. The human remains recovered from this civilization's cemeteries add a further, more direct layer to this picture, though one that requires careful and honest handling rather than a simple headline statistic. At Harappa, skeletal analysis has documented cranial trauma, injuries to the skull consistent with violent impact rather than accidental injury, in roughly 15% of adult individuals examined, among the highest rates of cranial injury recorded anywhere in South Asia across the full span from the Paleolithic through the Iron Age. That figure alone would seem to settle the question of whether this was a genuinely peaceful society. But the fuller picture, established through more detailed analysis of when and among whom these injuries occurred, complicates a simple reading considerably. The rate of cranial trauma at Harappa was notably higher in burials dating to the civilization's decline than during its urban peak, suggesting that whatever violence these injuries reflect intensified as the broader system of cities began to fail, rather than representing a constant, steady background level of violence throughout the civilization's history. Researchers examining the pattern in detail have also found that this trauma appears to have been socially differentiated, distributed unevenly across gender and status lines, rather than randomly across the population, with meaningful injuries documented among women as well as men, including individuals buried in a cemetery associated with higher status. This distinction changes what the evidence actually supports. It does not describe a civilization engaged in constant, generalized warfare throughout its centuries of urban life. It describes something closer to a society experiencing real, structured interpersonal violence, concentrated unevenly across its population and its timeline, worsening markedly as the broader civilization came under strain in its final centuries. A very similar pattern, incidentally, to the smaller cemetery excavated at Rakhigarhi, where only 1 of 10 examined skeletons showed comparable trauma, a lower rate that researchers have suggested may itself point towards differences in violence between communities, rather than a single uniform level of danger experienced identically everywhere across this civilization's territory. Consider what this more precise picture actually implies, set against the walls examined in the chapter before this one. Defensive architecture built with real seriousness, bastions, guarded gateways, barbicans, describes a civilization that took the possibility of external threat seriously enough to invest enormous labor guarding against it, for however long that threat existed, at whatever intensity. Weapons kept close at hand in ordinary homes describe a population equipped and, when necessary, apparently willing to defend itself directly. Skeletal trauma that intensifies specifically during the civilization's period of decline describes not a society defined by war from its earliest urban centuries, but one whose underlying tensions, and whatever mechanisms had previously kept those tensions contained, appear to have frayed as the broader system supporting these cities began to come apart. A woman examined among the burials at Harappa, her skull bearing a healed fracture from an old injury survived rather than fatal, represents exactly the kind of individual case that resists easy generalization in either direction. She lived through violence severe enough to fracture bone and lived long enough afterwards for that injury to heal completely. Evidence neither of a uniquely peaceful existence nor of constant, unrelenting warfare, but of the same kind of hard, occasionally violent, fundamentally human life that has characterized most settled societies across most of recorded history, this one included, whatever its plumbing and city planning might have otherwise suggested about the character of daily life within its walls. What this evidence resists, decisively, is the version of the peaceful civilization claim that circulated for much of the 20th century, the idea of a society that had somehow escaped violence altogether, defended by nothing because it needed to defend against nothing, its weapons dismissed as farming tools because a truly peaceful people, the reasoning implicitly assumed, would have no reason to arm themselves at all. Walls with guard rooms, axes stored beside grinding stones by the thousand, and a documented, if uneven and time-concentrated pattern of cranial trauma make that specific, absolute claim considerably harder to defend than it once was. What remains genuinely open, and what the most careful current scholarship continues to argue over rather than resolve, is how this real but complicated evidence of violence should be weighed against everything examined earlier: the uniform housing, the modest graves, the total absence of a palace or a war-boasting inscription. A civilization can be organized without hierarchy and still experience interpersonal violence. It can maintain serious defensive walls for generations without necessarily fighting frequent large-scale wars behind them. The evidence gathered so far describes neither a peaceful utopia nor a militarized conquering empire. It describes something less tidy than either story, and the next body of evidence, drawn from the wreckage left behind at the very moment these cities were first taking shape, will push that question further still. At a site called Kot Diji, east of the great city that would eventually rise at Mohenjo-daro, A fortified settlement stood through the final centuries of the early Harappan period. Its citadel raised on a platform, its outer wall reinforced with bastions at regular intervals. Excavators cutting through its layers found something striking, a clear band of burned debris separating the earlier levels of the settlement from those that came after. Ash and charred material, thick enough to mark an unmistakable event rather than the gradual accumulation of ordinary household fires. Something happened here, sometime around 2500 BC, violent enough or extensive enough to leave a permanent scar in the ground. Kot Diji was not alone. Comparable layers of burning, marking the same rough transition between the early Harappan and mature Harappan periods, have been documented at Amri, at Naushero, and in signs of disruption at Kalibangan as well. Sites separated by considerable distance yet showing a similar pattern at a similar point in time. When archaeologists began compiling broader settlement data across the wider region, the pattern grew still more striking. In the Cholistan Desert alone, of 37 settlements documented from the early Harappan period, 33 were abandoned by the time the mature Harappan period began, and the overwhelming majority of new mature Harappan settlements in that same region were founded on entirely fresh ground rather than built atop their predecessors. A family living at Kot Diji in its final early Harappan years would have known this settlement as home in the fullest sense, its citadel wall a familiar silhouette against the sky, its streets and workshops the accumulated product of generations. Whatever happened in the fire that left its mark in the excavated layers, whether it arrived suddenly in a single catastrophic night, or the settlement's decline unfolded over a longer, harder stretch of seasons, the world that family had known did not simply continue afterward in the same form. Something ended here, definitively enough that when the mature urban period began nearby, its planners largely chose not to rebuild on the same ground. The interpretation of this burning has divided archaeologists for decades, and honesty requires presenting both sides with real weight rather than favoring the more dramatic reading simply because it fits a narrative already in motion. Some researchers who have examined the burnt layer directly have concluded the fire was most likely accidental rather than the result of deliberate attack, pointing to strong cultural continuity in pottery styles and other material culture immediately following the fire, evidence, in this reading, that the same population simply rebuilt rather than being replaced or driven off by hostile outsiders. A settlement of mud brick and timber, in a hot, dry climate, hardly requires an enemy to catch fire. Cooking accidents, lamp spills, and structural failures have destroyed far more ancient settlements throughout history than warfare ever has. Others studying the same evidence have reached less settled conclusions, noting that accidental fires, however common, rarely produce the same consistent, near-simultaneous pattern of destruction visible across multiple separate settlements within a comparatively narrow window of time. A single accidental fire at a single site proves little. A pattern repeating at Kot Diji, Amri, and Naushero, alongside a documented wave of site abandonment across the wider region during the very same transitional period, at minimum raises the kind of question that pure coincidence struggles to answer comfortably, even if it cannot, on its own, prove organized conflict was the specific cause. What is not seriously disputed is the outcome, regardless of what triggered it. Whatever combination of fire, environmental pressure, and shifting settlement patterns unfolded during these final early Harappan centuries, it reshaped where and how people in this region chose to build their lives going forward, on a scale too large to dismiss as background noise. Communities that had occupied the same ground for generations relocated to new sites entirely. The old fortified towns of the early Harappan period, their bastioned walls and elevated citadels built with real defensive seriousness, gave way to something different. The vastly larger, more uniformly planned cities of the mature Harappan period, built increasingly from scratch rather than layered atop what had come before. A single scholar's explanation cannot resolve what happened here, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be said, weighing both readings fairly, is this. the world that produced the great planned cities already explored, their grid streets, their standardized bricks, their absence of a visible king, did not emerge from an uninterrupted, peaceful continuity stretching back to Mehrgarh's first farmers. It emerged on the far side of a genuine disruption, one written into the burnt soil at multiple settlements across the region. Whatever combination of accident, environmental pressure, and possible conflict actually produced it. The urban world already examined in such detail across earlier chapters was not simply planted. Something first had to clear the ground. This is the closest the archaeological record comes anywhere in this civilization's long history to a documented moment of crisis serious enough to leave physical proof behind. Burned foundations where a home once stood, a settlement left behind rather than rebuilt on the same ground. It sits chronologically before the great cities themselves rise to the scale already walked through in earlier chapters, a foundation moment as much as a mystery in its own right, and it offers no clean resolution, only the same honest uncertainty that has defined nearly every question this civilization has posed since its rediscovery a century ago. What it does confirm, beyond reasonable dispute, is that peace, if that word applies to any part of this story, was never the uninterrupted condition of this civilization's entire history. Something was already burning before the first brick of Mohenjo-daro's grid was ever laid. For decades, the search for a direct account of conflict involving this civilization stopped here, at a burnt layer with no accompanying words to explain it. But roughly 700 years after these fires, in a very different set of ruins, in a language that can actually be read, one further piece of evidence surfaced. Brief, contested, and unlike anything else examined so far, a written record, not from these people themselves, but from a neighbor who claimed, in a single surviving inscription, to have fought them. Around 2270 BC, in the Akkadian Empire ruling much of Mesopotamia, a king named Rimush, son of the empire's founder Sargon, campaigned eastward against the kingdom of Marhashi and its allies. Afterward, following the standard practice of Akkadian kings, an inscription was carved commemorating the victory, listing the enemies defeated, the casualties inflicted, and the captives taken. Among the forces said to have assembled against Rimush at this battle, fighting alongside the armies of Marhashi, Elam, and other regional powers, the inscription names a people called Meluha. This single word carries enormous weight, because Meluha is the same name Mesopotamian texts consistently use elsewhere to describe a distant trading partner reached by sea, a partner whose goods, cotton textiles, carnelian, ivory, closely match what this civilization is known to have produced and exported, and whose merchants, according to other surviving records, required dedicated interpreters to communicate in Mesopotamian courts. The identification of Meluha with this civilization is not universally certain beyond any possible doubt, but it commands very broad scholarly support, built from a substantial and consistent body of trade records, seal evidence, and geographic reasoning accumulated across more than a century of study. If that identification holds, the implications are significant. The inscription describes Rimush confronting a coalition of forces at Marhashi, striking down thousands of enemy soldiers and taking thousands more as captives, a battle account that, if the Meluha named within it truly refers to this civilization, would represent the only surviving written testimony from any civilization describing this people engaged directly in armed conflict. Every other piece of evidence explored so far, the walls, the weapons, the skeletal trauma, has had to be argued from physical remains alone, interpreted without the benefit of a single word of explanation. This inscription, if the identification is correct, would be the sole exception, a foreign scribe's account of Meluhan participation in an actual battle, however brief and however far from home. But that single word of caution, if it carries real interpretive weight, and it deserves to be treated with the same rigor applied to every other piece of evidence in this account, rather than seized upon simply because it offers the tantalizing possibility of a definitive answer. Ancient royal inscriptions were propaganda first and historical records second, composed to glorify a king's victories rather than to provide balanced or necessarily accurate accounts of who actually fought and how. A scribe working for Rimush had every incentive to inflate the list of defeated enemies, and none whatsoever to ensure precise geographic accuracy about a distant, semi-legendary trading partner few in the Mesopotamian court would ever personally encounter. There is also the more basic question of what participation in this battle would actually mean, even granting the identification as accurate. The inscription describes a coalition of Eastern powers assembling against Rimush at Marhashi, far from this civilization's own territory, raising the possibility that any Meluhan involvement, if it occurred at all, took the form of allied troops, mercenaries, or a trading partner drawn into someone else's regional conflict, rather than direct warfare initiated by or against this civilization on its own account. A single ambiguous mention in a foreign king's victory inscription cannot, by itself, establish whether this civilization fought wars of its own, participated occasionally in a distant neighbor's conflicts, or whether the reference describes something else, a mistranslation, a confusion of similarly named peoples, an exaggeration inserted for the scribe's own rhetorical purposes, entirely. Picture, even so, what this fragment would mean if every uncertain element resolved in its favor, if Meluha genuinely means this civilization, if the identification of these forces as Meluhan troops is accurate rather than error or embellishment, if their presence at this battle reflects a real military commitment rather than an incidental mention. It would mean that somewhere on a battlefield near Marhashi, in the 23rd century BC, soldiers or allied fighters connected to the same cities already walked through in such detail, the same drains, the same seals, the same undeciphered script, stood among the thousands of casualties a Mesopotamian scribe later recorded in stone, a fragment of lived experience belonging to a people who otherwise left behind no account of their own history whatsoever. It is precisely because this fragment carries such weight, and remains so thoroughly unconfirmed, that it belongs at the very edge of the evidentiary record examined in this account, rather than at its center. One ambiguous reference in a foreign king's battle inscription cannot settle a debate that walls, weapons, burials, and a century of careful archaeology have not been able to settle on their own. What it does offer, honestly weighed alongside everything else gathered here, is one further data point pointing in the same general direction as the walls and the weapons and the skeletal trauma already established. The possibility, never certain, never disproven, that this civilization's relationship to violence was considerably more complicated than the peaceful reading that dominated popular understanding of it for the better part of a century. With this fragment weighed and set carefully in its place, the full body of evidence this civilization has yielded across its cities, its trade, its script, its governance, its walls, its weapons, and this single contested foreign inscription has now been examined as thoroughly and as honestly as the archaeological and textual record currently allows. No verdict has been reached because none is available. What remains is to follow this civilization to its final centuries and to understand, as closely as the evidence permits, not why it fought or did not fight, but why, after surviving for well over 1,000 years, it finally stopped existing at all. Somewhere in a household in Mohenjo-daro's lower town, sometime after 1900 BC, a woman notices what her mother would never have tolerated. The drain outside their door has stopped running clear. Silt has begun collecting where it should flow freely, and no one from the citadel has come to clear it in longer than she can remember. The street itself, once swept and maintained with the same civic attention paid to every other lane in the city, now shows the first signs of neglect, refuse, accumulating in corners that would once have been kept clean as a matter of course. She does not know it, but she is living through the final generation of a system that took her ancestors well over 1,000 years to build. The material record of this decline, once excavators learned to look for it, turns out to be strikingly precise. even without a single written word explaining it. Beginning sometime after 1900 BC and accelerating through the following centuries, the meticulous planning that defined this civilization's peak begins to visibly degrade. Large multi-room courtyard homes at Mohenjo-daro were subdivided into smaller, more cramped living spaces. Public buildings that once served collective civic functions fell into disuse. The famous Great Bath itself, by the time this period draws to its close, appears to have accumulated debris and gone unmaintained. Its careful bitumen waterproofing no longer serving the purpose it was built for. This was not a sudden collapse. It reads, in the archaeological layers themselves, as a slow erosion of the standards a civilization had once enforced almost universally. No single cause explains this decline with full confidence, and the honest position, after a century of dedicated study, remains one of genuine, still contested uncertainty. The strongest current evidence points toward climate. Multiple independent lines of research, isotope analysis of ancient teeth and bone, sediment records from distant lake beds, oxygen isotope studies drawn directly from archaeological sites along the old river courses, converge on a weakening of the monsoon system beginning around 2000 BC, part of a broader pattern of climatic stress that affected societies well beyond this civilization's own territory during the same centuries. A civilization built entirely around the predictable rhythm of seasonal river flooding would have felt that weakening acutely, its irrigation, its agricultural surplus, and ultimately its capacity to sustain cities at their previous scale. Compounding this climatic pressure was a second, more localized catastrophe, the drying of the Gagga-Hakra river system, the eastern waterway that had supported a substantial portion of this civilization's settlements, alongside the Indus itself. Geological surveys of the region, including early work identifying long dry riverbeds in what is now a largely desert landscape, confirm that this once significant river gradually failed, whether through the same weakening monsoon, a shift in tectonic activity redirecting its flow, or some combination of both. Settlements that had depended on its water for generations found themselves, over the course of decades rather than a single dramatic event, stranded beside a river that increasingly was not there. A farmer working fields near this failing river system in the final mature Harappan generations would have noticed the change first in his crops, not in any dramatic single season of disaster, but in a slow, discouraging pattern repeating year after year. Wheat and barley, the staple grains that had sustained this civilization since its earliest urban centuries, became harder to grow reliably. Archaeological evidence from sites including Harappa itself shows a documented shift towards hardier, less demanding crops like millet during this period, a practical adaptation to worsening conditions, and also an unmistakable sign of a system under real and sustained agricultural stress. The consequences of this environmental pressure rippled outward through every part of the system already examined in this account. As agricultural surplus declined, the trade network reaching towards Mesopotamia, already documented through seals, goods, and Mesopotamian textual references to Meluha, began to weaken as well. Mesopotamian records referencing direct contact with this civilization grew markedly less frequent in the centuries after 2000 BC, and eventually stopped appearing altogether, a silence that mirrors, in its own way, the silence this civilization had always maintained about itself, except that now even its trading partners had stopped speaking of it. Disease compounded the pressure further. Skeletal analysis from Harappa's later burial contexts shows a marked increase in evidence of infection and chronic illness compared to the civilization's urban peak, a pattern consistent with declining sanitation, nutritional stress, and the kind of vulnerability that follows when carefully maintained civic infrastructure, the drains, the wells, the waste management systems already examined in such detail, begins to break down from simple lack of continued maintenance. A civilization whose sanitation had once exceeded anything else in the ancient world was, in its final centuries, gradually losing the very systems that had made that achievement possible. By approximately 1800 BC, the largest and most iconic of these cities, Mohenjo-daro chief among them, show clear evidence of dramatic depopulation. Some settlements, including the port city of Lothal, continued to be inhabited after this point, but by populations living amid the ruins of a greater civic achievement rather than sustaining it, occupying poorly built structures where carefully planned brick housing had once stood, no longer repairing what their ancestors had built with such evident care. This was not abandonment in a single dramatic exodus. It was contraction, generation by generation, as fewer and fewer people found reason or resource to maintain a system built for a scale of population and agricultural surplus that no longer existed. Many of this civilization's people, current evidence suggests, moved gradually eastward, away from the failing Gagar-Hakra system and towards the more reliable water sources of the Ganges basin, carrying fragments of their material culture and agricultural knowledge into smaller, more dispersed rural settlements, rather than rebuilding cities on the scale of what they had left behind. This was, in its own way, a continuation rather than a true ending. The same people, or their direct descendants, persisted in a fundamentally different form of settlement, the great urban achievement of their ancestors receding gradually into a more modest, more rural, and eventually largely forgotten memory. It would be a mistake, weighing all of this evidence honestly, to reduce this decline to any single tidy cause. Climate change alone, most current scholars agree, does not fully explain the timing and pattern of contraction observed across the archaeological record. Trade disruption alone cannot account for the physical evidence of declining sanitation and civic maintenance within the cities themselves. Disease alone does not explain the broader regional pattern of settlement abandonment stretching across such an enormous territory. The most defensible current position treats this as a genuine systems collapse. Environmental stress, agricultural failure, weakening trade, and disease compounding one another across several difficult centuries, each pressure making the others harder to withstand, until the elaborate, interconnected civilization examined across this entire account simply could no longer sustain itself at its former scale. What did not happen deserves equal emphasis, because it shaped how this civilization would eventually be misunderstood for the better part of a century after its rediscovery. No archaeological evidence supports a sudden, violent conquest by outside invaders sweeping through and destroying these cities in a single dramatic campaign. The theory once popular among early 20th century historians, who read signs of decline as evidence of an Aryan invasion arriving to finish off an already weakened civilization. Modern archaeology has moved decisively away from that reading. What the evidence actually shows is slower, less dramatic, and in its own way more unsettling. A sophisticated civilization gradually losing its grip on the very systems, agricultural, hydraulic, civic, that had made its remarkable achievements possible in the first place. By around 1300 BC, the last identifiable traces of this civilization's distinct material culture disappear from the archaeological record entirely. The standardized bricks, the citywide drainage systems, the carved seals, the weights calibrated to a single shared standard across a territory the size of a modern nation, all of it fades into the broader, more regionally fragmented cultures that would eventually give rise to later South Asian civilization. The cities themselves, no longer maintained, no longer populated, were gradually buried beneath their own accumulated dust and the slow work of centuries, disappearing so completely that for well over 3,000 years, no one living in the region above them had any memory that a civilization of this scale had ever existed there at all. In 1827, a soldier serving in the artillery of the East India Company deserted his post at Agra, taking with him a companion and a false identity. James Lewis, travelling under the assumed name Charles Masson to avoid the punishment that awaited deserters in that era, spent the following years wandering through the borderlands of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, driven by a genuine passion for antiquities and old coins, rather than any specific historical mission. In March or April of 1829, on his way towards Lahore, Masson came upon an enormous mound near an abandoned course of the Ravi River, close to a town called Sahiwal, its surface studded with exposed brick structures on a scale he had not expected to find. Masson had no way of knowing what he had actually found. Working from the assumptions available to a self-taught antiquarian of his era, he concluded the ruins likely dated to the campaigns of Alexander the Great, roughly 2,000 years earlier, a plausible guess given the scale of the brickwork and the absence of any better explanation. He sketched the site carefully, documented what he observed, and published his account in 1842, becoming the first European to record the existence of Harappa. He had, without any way of grasping the true scale of his discovery, found the edge of a civilization more than 3,000 years older than the conqueror he assumed had built it. Nearly a century passed before anyone returned to fully investigate what Masson had glimpsed. It was not until the early 1920s that formal, systematic excavation began, first at Harappa itself in 1921, then at Mohenjo-daro the following year, work carried out under the Archaeological Survey of India, with John Marshall serving as director. What Marshall's teams uncovered, layer by careful layer, dwarfed anything Masson could have imagined standing atop that mound a century earlier. This was not the remnant of a campaign by a foreign conqueror. It was the buried evidence of an entire lost civilization, one that predated even the earliest known contact between this region and the Mediterranean world by well over 1,000 years. By 1924, Marshall was confident enough in what his teams had recovered: standardized bricks, sophisticated drainage, carved seals bearing a completely unfamiliar script, to announce the discovery formally to the wider scholarly world. The announcement reshaped, virtually overnight, the accepted timeline of civilization in South Asia, pushing its origins back thousands of years earlier than most historians of the era had previously believed possible, and establishing this civilization, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia, as one of the small handful of places on Earth where cities, writing, and complex urban life had emerged independently in the very earliest stages of human civilization itself. A century of excavation since that announcement has recovered an extraordinary amount. Cities laid out with a precision that still surprises visitors today, a trade network reaching from these river valleys to the heart of Mesopotamia, a written script still resisting every serious attempt at translation, walls that speak to real anxiety about intrusion, weapons scattered through ordinary homes, and a pattern of decline written into failing rivers and abandoned drains. What that century of work has not recovered, and may never recover, is a single sentence in this civilization's own words, explaining who governed these cities, what these people believed, or how they understood the violence their own material remains increasingly suggest they were not entirely free of. Return, finally, to that same doorway in Mohenjo-daro's lower town, the same merchant pressing a carved stone into wet clay, the mark he leaves behind, destined to outlast him by 5,000 years. Everything examined since that opening image, the drains running beneath his street, the great bath rising above the citadel, the ships carrying his city's goods toward Mesopotamia, the walls built to keep out whatever threat his city took seriously enough to fortify against, the weapon likely resting somewhere in his own home, has added enormous depth and specificity to that single scene. None of it has resolved the question standing quietly behind all of it. Was this civilization the one genuine exception in the ancient world, a large, sophisticated, urbanized society that somehow avoided the concentrated hierarchy and organized warfare that shaped nearly every comparable civilization in human history? Or was it simply a civilization whose hierarchy and violence took forms the archaeological record has proven unusually difficult to read, present in the weight of a seal, the thickness of a wall, the fracture in a skull, rather than in a palace or a boastful inscription? Both readings remain fully alive today, argued by serious scholars working from the same body of evidence, and neither has achieved anything close to a final, settled consensus. That unresolved tension is not a failure of a century of careful archaeology. It is the accurate, honest shape of what the evidence actually supports, and it says something significant about the limits of what any civilization's physical remains, however extensive, however carefully studied, can ultimately tell those who come long after it has ended. Bricks can describe how people built. Graves can describe how people buried their dead. Seals can hint at how people organized trade and, perhaps, status. None of it can fully substitute for the one thing this civilization never left behind: its own voice, explaining itself, in its own words, to anyone patient enough to listen. Perhaps, someday, that voice will finally be heard. A future excavation might yet uncover the long inscription, the bilingual text, the equivalent of a Rosetta Stone that a century of searching has not yet found, and the 400 silent signs carved into thousands of surviving seals might finally resolve into language, into names, into an account of governance and conflict, written by the people who actually lived it. Until that day, if it ever comes, everything gathered here remains what it has always been, the most careful, honest reconstruction available, built entirely from what these people did, rather than anything they ever chose or were able to say. So return one final time to the river and to the mark left behind in a lump of wet clay 5,000 years ago. The merchant who made it has been gone for longer than most of human history has lasted. The city around him rose, thrived for the better part of 1,000 years, and slowly, quietly, came apart. What he left behind still sits in a museum case today, fully visible, fully preserved, and, in the deepest sense that matters, still entirely silent, waiting, as it has waited for 5,000 years, for someone who can finally read what it says.